Grace, I'm sorry, but I have to fire you.
You're firing me for defending the civil rights of a veteran?
They fired her for defending a veteran service dog. Then, an entire Marine unit showed up. Grace Donnelly had managed Sunrise Cafe for 6 years, pouring her heart into every cup of coffee and every act of kindness. When she refused to kick out a disabled veteran and his service dog during a health inspection, her boss fired her on the spot. But as Grace packed her belongings with tears in her eyes, she had no idea that Colonel Richard Gaines was already mobilizing his Marines to show her what real loyalty looked like. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Sunrise Cafe, casting golden light across the worn wooden tables where locals gathered for their daily dose of caffeine and community. Grace Donnelly moved behind the counter with practiced efficiency, her auburn hair pulled back and her smile genuine despite the early hour. At 34, Grace had built more than a business, she'd created a sanctuary. The walls were lined with photos of local families and military units, while the corner booth was permanently reserved for veterans. The cafe's motto painted above the register read, "Where every story matters," and Grace lived those words every day. The morning rush was in full swing when Sergeant First Class Marcus Thompson pushed through the front door, his service dog Ranger at his side. Marcus was a regular, a soft-spoken man whose left leg had been amputated after an IED explosion in Afghanistan. Ranger, a golden retriever with intelligent brown eyes, was more than a companion. He was Marcus's lifeline, trained to detect seizures and provide stability when PTSD episodes threatened to overwhelm his handler. "Morning, Marcus," Grace called out, already reaching for his usual black coffee with 2 sugars and a blueberry muffin. "How's Ranger doing today?" "Good morning, Grace," Marcus replied, his voice carrying the careful control of someone who'd learned to manage his demons one day at a time. "He's having a good day. We both are." Grace smiled as she prepared his order, noting how Ranger positioned himself perfectly to provide support if Marcus needed it. The dog wore his service vest with the dignity of a soldier, his training evident in every alert glance and protective stance. The cafe buzzed with its usual morning energy construction workers, grabbing coffee teachers preparing for another day, and retirees settling in for their daily chess games. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where stories were shared over steaming mugs, and where Grace had found purpose after losing her husband David in a helicopter crash in Iraq 3 years earlier. "Every story matters," Grace whispered to herself as she watched Marcus settle into his usual booth, Ranger lying quietly at his feet. It was the phrase David had always said when she doubted whether their small acts of kindness made a difference. She had no idea that this peaceful morning was about to test everything she believed about dignity, loyalty, and doing what was right, even when it cost everything. Grace was restocking the pastry case when the bell above the door chimed with unusual authority. 2 figures entered, a stern-faced woman in a crisp business suit carrying a clipboard and a man in an ill-fitting uniform who looked uncomfortable. "I'm Inspector Patricia Hawkins from the Georgia Department of Public Health," the woman announced, her voice cutting through the cafe's morning chatter. "This is a routine health inspection." Grace straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. "Of course, I'm Grace Donnelly, the manager. How can I help you?" Inspector Hawkins surveyed the cafe with cold efficiency, her eyes sweeping over clean counters and properly stored food before landing on Marcus Thompson, who was sitting in his corner booth with Ranger lying quietly at his feet. "There's an animal in your food service establishment," Hawkins said, her tone suggesting she'd discovered a major violation. "That's a direct violation of Georgia Health Code, Section 511.6.1.03. Grace felt her stomach drop, but kept her voice steady. "That's a service dog, ma'am. Ranger is a trained medical alert dog for Sergeant Thompson, who's a disabled veteran." "I don't care if it's the president's dog," Hawkins replied, making notes on her clipboard. "Animals are not permitted in food service establishments." Marcus had gone rigid in his seat, his face flushing with the familiar combination of anger and humiliation that came with having his disability questioned. Ranger sensed his handler's distress and moved closer, providing the calming pressure that helped Marcus maintain control. "Ma'am," Grace said, stepping forward, "service dogs are protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act. They're allowed in all public accommodations." "Not during a health inspection," Hawkins shot back. "The animal needs to be removed immediately, or I'll cite this establishment for a major violation." The cafe had gone silent, with every customer watching the confrontation unfold. Grace could see the pain in Marcus's eyes, the way his hands shook slightly as he reached for Ranger's leash. She'd seen that look before on David's face, when bureaucrats had questioned his decisions on other veterans' faces when the system they'd served failed to serve them back. "Inspector Hawkins," Grace said, her voice carrying the quiet strength that had gotten her through 3 years of widowhood, "I understand you have a job to do, but Sergeant Thompson is a disabled veteran who needs his service dog. I'm not going to ask him to leave." "Then you're in violation of state health codes," Hawkins replied, her pen moving across the clipboard with vindictive satisfaction. Grace felt the weight of 6 years of building this business of creating a place where people felt valued and respected. She thought about the mortgage payments, the employees who depended on their jobs, the community that had embraced her cafe as their gathering place. Then she looked at Marcus, who was struggling to stand his prosthetic leg, making the simple act of rising a challenge that Ranger was trained to help him navigate. "Every story matters," Grace said quietly, repeating the phrase that had guided her through the darkest days after David's death. Then noted, "But Sergeant Thompson and Ranger are welcome here, and they're staying." The inspector's eyes narrowed with satisfaction. "We'll see about that," she said, pulling out her phone to make a call that would change everything. Grace didn't know it yet, but her stand was about to cost her everything she'd worked for and reveal who her real friends were. Grace arrived at the cafe early to find her boss, Robert Chin, waiting in the parking lot, his expensive sedan looking out of place next to the pickup trucks of the cafe's usual clientele. "Grace, we need to talk," he said without preamble, his voice carrying cold authority. "Of course, Mr. Chen," Grace replied, unlocking the front door. "Would you like some coffee?" "This isn't a social call," Chen said, following her inside. "Inspector Hawkins says you refused to comply with a direct order during an official inspection." Grace began her morning routine, turning on equipment, checking temperatures, preparing for another day of serving her community. "I stood up for a disabled veteran's right to have his service dog with him. It's protected under federal law." "It's a violation of state health codes," Chen countered, pulling out his phone to show her missed calls and angry voicemails. Do you have any idea what this could cost us? The health department could shut us down, fine us thousands, destroy our reputation. Mr. Chen, Sergeant Thompson, lost his leg serving our country. His service dog helps him manage seizures and PTSD. I wasn't going to humiliate him. Your job is to manage this cafe according to regulations, not to play social worker with every sob story that walks through the door. The words hit Grace like a physical blow. Sob story? That man sacrificed his leg for our freedom. I'm calling it a liability, Chen shot back. Grace, you've let your emotions cloud your judgment. I can't have a manager who puts personal feelings above business regulations. What Grace didn't know was that Marcus's daughter, Sarah, had been recording the confrontation for a college project. The video she posted to social media was devastating in its simplicity, Grace calmly defending Marcus's rights while Inspector Hawkins made aggressive demands. This is what real courage looks like, Sarah had written. A cafe manager standing up for my dad's dignity. Grace Donnelly is a hero. The video went viral within hours, shared by veterans organizations and ordinary citizens moved by Grace's stand. Comments poured in from across the country with people sharing their own stories and praising Grace's courage. But viral fame came with a price. Chen's phone rang constantly with reporters, angry customers, and corporate partners expressing concern about negative publicity. Grace, he said when he called that evening, this has gotten out of hand. The video is everywhere and it's making us look bad. How is standing up for a veteran's rights making us look bad? Because it makes it look like we don't follow health department regulations. I've got investors asking questions, and the health department is threatening a full investigation. Friday morning brought the confrontation Grace had been dreading. Chen arrived with a termination letter and a security guard. Grace, I'm sorry, but I have to let you go, he said, his voice lacking any trace of remorse. Your actions have created a liability I can't ignore. Grace stared at the letter, seeing 6 years of her life reduced to corporate speak about failure to comply with established protocols. You're firing me for defending a veteran's civil rights? I'm firing you for insubordination and failure to follow health department directives. Your final paycheck will be direct deposited, and I'll need your keys. Grace looked around the cafe she'd built into a community gathering place, at the photos on the walls, at the corner booth where Marcus sat every morning. Mr. Chen, she said, her voice steady, despite the tears threatening to fall. I hope you can sleep at night, knowing you chose money over human dignity. As she packed her belongings into a cardboard box, Grace whispered David's favorite phrase one more time: every story matters. She just hoped hers wasn't ending here. Grace woke up unemployed for the first time in 6 years, the reality hitting her like a cold wave. Her savings wouldn't last long without steady income, and the viral video had brought attention, but not job offers. A knock at her door interrupted her brooding. Marcus Thompson stood on her doorstep, Ranger at his side, both looking uncomfortable. Grace, I heard what happened. I heard you lost your job because of me. You didn't cost me my job, Grace said firmly. My boss's lack of humanity cost me my job. That cafe was your life. People are calling you a hero, but I know what this really cost you. Grace invited him in, watching how Ranger immediately positioned himself to provide support. Marcus, can I tell you something? When David died, I thought my life was over. But yesterday, when I stood up for you and Ranger, I remembered what he always said about service. What was that? That real service isn't about following orders or pleasing superiors. It's about doing what's right, even when it costs everything. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Grace, there's something you should know. The video has done more than go viral. People are organizing. Someone from Fort Granger called a Colonel Gaines. Grace felt a chill. What did he want? I don't know exactly, but he's planning something big. Sunday brought an unexpected visitor to Grace's apartment complex. She was taking out trash when she noticed a man in military dress blues studying the building directory with focused attention. "Excuse me," he said when he spotted her. "I'm looking for Grace Donnelly." "I'm Grace," she replied, noting the colonel's insignia and serious expression. "Ma'am, I'm Colonel Richard Gaines from Fort Granger. I wonder if we could talk." Grace's heart raced as she led the colonel to her apartment, wondering if she was in trouble. Had her defense of Marcus somehow violated military protocol? "Ms. Donnelly," Colonel Gaines said once they were seated, "what you did at that cafe has resonated throughout the military community. Your stand for Sergeant Thompson represents the values we try to instill in our Marines." "Thank you, sir, but I just did what anyone should do." "No, ma'am, you did what few people have the courage to do. You put principle above profit, dignity above convenience." Gaines leaned forward, his expression intense. "Ms. Donnelly, I have a proposition for you, but first I need to ask, are you free tomorrow morning around 900? I'm unemployed, Colonel. I'm free whenever you need me." "Good," Gaines said, standing to leave, "because tomorrow you're going to see what happens when the military community decides to show its appreciation for someone who stood up for one of our own." Grace felt a mixture of hope and apprehension. "Colonel, what exactly are you planning?" "Ma'am, you stood up for a Marine when it cost you everything. Tomorrow, we're going to show you that every story matters, especially yours." As the colonel left, Grace realized he'd used David's phrase, the words that had guided her through the hardest decision of her career. She had no idea that her quiet Sunday evening was the calm before a storm that would change her life forever. That night, Grace couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about David, about the values he'd died defending, about the choice she'd made to honor those values even when it cost her livelihood. She'd lost her job, but she'd kept her integrity. "Every story matters," she whispered into the darkness, hoping that somehow, somewhere, David knew she'd chosen right. Outside her window, the town of Mason slept peacefully, unaware that tomorrow would bring an event that would be talked about for decades to come. Grace's story was about to become everyone's story, a reminder that courage could come from the most unexpected places, and that standing up for what's right always mattered, even when it seemed like no one was watching. The phone rang once during the night, a reporter wanting a comment about the controversy surrounding service animals in restaurants. Grace didn't answer. There was no controversy in her mind, just right and wrong, and she'd chosen right. As dawn approached, Grace finally fell asleep, dreaming of David and the cafe, and a future she couldn't yet imagine. She had no idea that in a few hours her faith in humanity would be restored in the most spectacular way possible. The woman who'd been fired for defending a veteran's dignity was about to discover that some stories matter so much that they inspire others to action, that sometimes losing everything is the first step toward finding something better, and that the military community never forgets those who stand up for their own. Tomorrow would prove that every story matters, But some stories have the power to change everything. Grace was getting dressed when she heard the rumble of vehicles outside her apartment complex. Looking out her window, she felt her knees go weak at the sight below. A convoy of military vehicles had pulled into the parking lot Humvee's transport trucks, and what appeared to be half the Marine Corps. Soldiers in dress blues were forming up in precise formations, while others unloaded equipment with military efficiency. "What in the world?" Grace whispered, grabbing her jacket and rushing downstairs. Colonel Gaines stood at the center of the organized chaos, directing operations with calm authority. When he spotted Grace, his weathered face broke into a smile. "Ms. Donnelly," he called out, "I hope you don't mind, but we brought a few friends." A few friends? Grace looked around at what appeared to be an entire battalion. "Colonel, what's going on?" "Ma'am, when word got out about what happened to you, it reached some very important people. The Commandant of the Marine Corps himself asked me to deliver a message." Gaines handed her an official envelope bearing the seal of the United States Marine Corps. With shaking hands, Grace opened it and read, "Ms. Donnelly, your courage in defending the dignity of a disabled veteran exemplifies the values we hold sacred. Your sacrifice has not gone unnoticed, and we are honored to call you a friend to the Corps. Semper Fidelis, General Patricia Morrison, Commandant, United States Marine Corps." "Colonel," Grace said, her voice breaking, "this is incredible, but I don't understand why you're all here." "Because, ma'am, we're going to make sure you don't suffer for doing the right thing. Marines take care of their own, and you've proven yourself to be one of us." What happened next would be talked about in Mason, Georgia, for decades. The Marine convoy, with Grace riding in the lead vehicle, proceeded through town toward Sunrise Cafe. Word had spread through social media and local news, and crowds lined the streets to watch the unprecedented show of military support. At the cafe, Robert Chin stood behind the counter serving a handful of customers, his face growing pale as he watched the convoy approach through the front windows. The viral video had already cost him business, with many locals choosing to boycott the establishment that had fired their beloved Grace. The Marines formed up in the parking lot with parade ground precision, their dress blues gleaming in the morning sun. Colonel Gaines, with Grace at his side, approached the cafe's front door. "Mr. Chin," Gaines said, as they entered, his voice carrying absolute authority. "I believe you know Ms. Donnelly." Chin's face had gone ashen as he realized the magnitude of what was happening. "Colonel, this is a private business matter." "Sir, when you fired someone for defending a disabled veteran's civil rights, you made it a matter of military interest," Gaines replied. "Ms. Donnelly stood up for one of our Marines when you chose profit over principle." The cafe had filled with Marines, their presence transforming the small space into something that felt more like a military ceremony. Customers who'd been quietly eating breakfast found themselves witnesses to an extraordinary display of military solidarity. Now, Gaines continued, "We're here to make Ms. Donnelly an offer that reflects her true value to the community she served so faithfully." Colonel Gaines turned to address not just Grace, but the assembled crowd that had gathered both inside and outside the cafe. Local news crews had arrived along with what seemed like half the town of Mason. "Ms. Donnelly," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the space, "the Marine Corps would like to offer you a position as director of the new Veteran Transition and Wellness Initiative at Fort Granger. Grace felt the world tilt around her as the implications sank in. "Director Colonel, I'm not qualified." "Ma'am, you've spent 6 years creating a space where veterans felt valued and supported. You've demonstrated the kind of leadership and moral courage we need in someone who'll be helping our Marines transition to civilian life." Gaines handed her another official document. "The position comes with a federal salary commensurate with your experience, full benefits, and the opportunity to make a real difference in the lives of veterans who need exactly the kind of support you've been providing." Grace looked around the cafe she'd called home for 6 years, at the photos on the walls that told the stories of her community, at Robert Chen's stunned face behind the counter. Then she looked at the Marines who'd come to show her that her sacrifice had meaning. "There's one condition," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Name it," Gaines replied. "I want Marcus Thompson and Ranger to be part of the program. If we're going to help veterans transition, we need veterans who understand the challenges to help lead the way." "Done," Gaines said without hesitation. "Sergeant Thompson has already agreed to serve as a peer counselor." As if summoned by his name, Marcus appeared in the cafe doorway, Ranger at his side, both wearing expressions of pride and gratitude that brought tears to Grace's eyes. "Grace," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion, "you stood up for me when it cost you everything. Now it's our turn to stand up for you." The cafe erupted in applause as Grace accepted the offer that would transform her from an unemployed cafe manager into a leader in veteran support services. Outside, the crowd cheered as word spread that justice had been served and loyalty rewarded. Robert Chen watched from behind his counter as the woman he'd fired for insubordination was celebrated as a hero by the very community he'd hoped to appease. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present that his attempt to avoid controversy had created the biggest controversy in Mason's recent history. "Every story matters," Grace said as she shook Colonel Gaines's hand, using the phrase that had guided her through the darkest moments. "Thank you for making sure mine had a happy ending." As the Marines prepared to escort Grace to her new life, she took one last look around the cafe that had been her sanctuary and smiled. Sometimes, losing everything was the only way to find out what you were really worth. The ribbon-cutting ceremony for the new Veteran Transition and Wellness Initiative drew dignitaries from across Georgia. But Grace Donnelly's attention was focused on the veterans and their families who would benefit from the program she'd spent 6 months developing. The center occupied a beautiful new building on Fort Granger, with spaces designed specifically for counseling, job training, and peer support. But the heart of the facility was the cafe, a warm, welcoming space where veterans could gather over coffee and conversation just like they had at Sunrise Cafe. "Director Donnelly," said General Patricia Morrison, the Marine Corps Commandant who'd flown in for the ceremony, "this program is already being studied for implementation at bases across the country. Your vision of treating veterans with dignity and respect is exactly what our Corps needs." Grace smiled, watching Marcus Thompson lead a group of newly discharged Marines through an orientation session, Ranger at his side, providing the same calm presence that had made him such an effective peer counselor. "General, the real credit goes to the veterans themselves. They're the ones doing the hard work of helping each other transition. Every story matters here." The program had exceeded every expectation. In 6 months, they'd helped over 200 veterans find employment, housing, and support services. But more importantly, they'd created a community where military service was honored and no one had to face their challenges alone. Grace had also found personal healing in her new role. The work honored David's memory while serving the military community he'd died protecting. She'd even started dating again a Marine chaplain who understood both her loss and her dedication to serving others. Grace, Marcus said, approaching with a young Marine who looked lost and overwhelmed. "I'd like you to meet Corporal Johnson. He's just finishing his service and could use someone to talk to." Grace extended her hand to the young Marine, seeing in his eyes the same uncertainty she'd once felt. "Corporal Johnson, welcome to the center. Would you like some coffee? I make a pretty good cup." Behind the counter of the new cafe, a framed photo showed Grace's last day at Sunrise Cafe, surrounded by the Marines who'd refused to let her sacrifice go unrecognized. Below it, a simple plaque read, "Where every story matters," a reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of courage could change everything. Robert Chen's cafe had closed 3 months after Grace's firing, unable to survive the community boycott. The building now housed a veteran-owned coffee shop that donated proceeds to the transition center. Grace had learned that standing up for what was right didn't always cost everything. Sometimes it was the first step toward finding everything you never knew you needed. Every story mattered, but some stories had the power to change the world.